This is the new DWARF II, and it's a compact, easy-to-use smart telescope that you can take photos of space with, and it can be controlled entirely with your mobile device. Within minutes, you can set this telescope up and be imaging your favorite celestial objects like the moon, nebulae, and galaxies, all within an affordable price point. I'm Sarah Matthews, and in this review, we're going to walk through the features and specifications of this product. I'm then going to walk you through how I use it, and I'm going to share some of the test shots that I took with it. I'm then going to go over what I liked and what I didn't, and whether or not I'd recommend it for others. So grab a snack and let's dive in. So maybe it's just me, but I feel like astrophotography is becoming more and more popular every day. But historically, it hasn't been the easiest or the cheapest type of photography to get into, which definitely and understandably puts off a lot of newcomers to this field, or what would be newcomers to this field. But apparently this little device here solves those challenges, because not only is it easy to use, it's also compact, versatile, and also has a reasonably affordable price point to it. And when I say reasonable and affordable, I'm saying that in comparison to other astrophotography rigs out there. So like I mentioned before, it's controlled entirely with a mobile device. So think a smartphone or a tablet. And it also comes with a dual camera design. And so there's a wide angle lens here and a telephoto lens here, which makes it nice for both terrestrial photography and videography, as well as astrophotography. Now, yes, it is an imaging system and a telescope, but in a lot of ways it's also a computer. So I think about today's modern, motorized go-to mounts. In order to have it slew to a target and track it throughout a night of imaging, you have to polar align it manually, which for those of you who have done this before know that it can take quite a bit of time sometimes, and it also determines where you're going to set up. But the DWARF II doesn't need to be polar aligned. Just calibrate it automatically with a plate solving calibration step. From there, it knows where it's looking at. And so you can then, go to any target you want to in the night sky, or at least that's visible from where you're imaging. It will center on it and it will track it throughout your imaging session. And so, in astrophotography, being able to track a target throughout an imaging session and keep it centered is really important, because we need to try to collect a lot of light from those targets because they're very faint. So if you want to see the details, you have to collect as much light as you can. And being able to have the target tracked automatically as the Earth rotates is pretty cool. Speaking on that note about collecting photons, the DWARF II also has a real-time stacking tool in the app. So as you are imaging and as each exposure comes in, it will calibrate, stack, and you can actually see the stacked image in real time. So you can start to see the details right there. This little device does promise a lot, and it has the potential of making space accessible to a lot more people out there, which is why I was excited when the folks over at Dwarf Lab, the creators of the DWARF II, reached out to me to review this product. And so I agreed on the condition that I can give a completely unbiased review about it. And so they agreed, and here we are with the DWARF II. And so I do get to keep the DWARF II, but again, all of the views I'm going to share in this review are 100% my own. So with all of the formalities and high-levelness stuff out of the way, let's see what came in the box. The DWARF II arrived in one box, which is cool because normally when you put together an astro rig, you receive a lot more boxes. The downside to just the single box, though, is that it's much harder to make a cardboard city with, like you can with all the other boxes you would normally get. After cutting open the shipping box, I was surprised to see another box inside of it. With my curiosity growing, I opened up the white box to see what else was inside. Not only was there another box, there was also this carrying bag, which spiced things up further. Since there's a theme here, let's open up the See Further box first. In the See Further box, we have a velvety plastic-like tray with 3 items. The first is a 400x microscope, which I plan to take a closer look at later. No pun intended. We also have a hard plastic container that has Dwarf Lab engraved on it. Inside of the container there are 3 astronomical filters. We have a 1¼ inch threaded UHC filter for light pollution, and we also have 2 1¼ inch neutral density filters for solar imaging. Since the Dwarf II has 2 camera lenses, you want to be sure to protect both when you're imaging the sun, or else you will blind the Dwarf II, which is not very nice. To apply the filters to the Dwarf II, it comes with a magnetic filter adapter that you thread the filters into and attach to the optical train of the Dwarf II. It's heavier than it looks, and it tells you which camera lens each circle cutout is for. On the back there is this cool engraving of the Big Dipper asterism. Now let's check out the carrying bag. The carrying bag feels well made and durable. There's a well-cushioned handle here on the top. It also has 2 zippers, a side pocket, 2 metal half-circle rings on each side for a shoulder strap. Let's dive further. Inside the bag, there's a startup manual written in English and Chinese. It also comes with a Samsung 64GB micro SD card. Next, we have this black shoulder strap, which you can fashion around your head, or as its intended use as a shoulder strap that connects to the sides of the Dwarf carrying bag. It also feels well made. Next, we have the Dwarf Lab mini tripod. It's a pretty standard tripod made from plastic with a 1/4 inch screw at the top to mount to the bottom of the Dwarf. Inside of the carrying bag, we have a mesh zipper pocket, 2 pockets on the lower half, and a Velcro divider that you can orient to your liking. Now for what you've probably really been waiting for, here is the Dwarf II in all of its glory. It's actually asleep right now and looks pretty cute. I do hate to disturb it, but let's go ahead and give this little guy some power. Speaking of power, it comes with a replaceable 5600 milliamp hour battery that can be recharged via a USB cord because there is a USB-C port down here on the base of the Dwarf. So now it's charging, and let's come back a little later. Okay, we're back, and it looks like the Dwarf II has regained all of its strength. I know this because there are 4 lights on the side that indicate the battery level. So let's unplug and take a deeper look. So the Dwarf II is really smooth through the touch, like very smooth. It's a kind of like a hard plastic. It feels really durable, but also lightweight at the same time. I'm not sure if those are opposing adjectives, but yeah, overall it weighs 2.4 pounds or 1 kilogram if you're using the metric system like everybody else does. And just to kind of give you a size comparison, here is a hardcover edition of the best-selling book Contact by the late Carl Sagan. And so if we just do this, they're almost about the same size, and if we do it this way, they're also almost about the same size, which is pretty cool that it can be so small. So I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but the Dwarf II has a dual camera design. So there's a telephoto lens here with a wide angle lens here, and they do work independently of one another, but you can also use them together to frame up shots, which is really helpful. I'll show you how that works a little bit later. Personally, I was very surprised to learn that the Dwarf II has a telephoto lens inside, just given the dimensions of the Dwarf II, but it does, and that's because it uses what's called a periscope design. So here in this illustration, you can see how the light path is bent by a prism inside of the optical train, and so this kind of achieves 2 things. It allows the Dwarf II to have a more compact design, but it also allows it to be more stable because it has a lower center of gravity, which makes it nice for when you're tracking objects. And so the telephoto lens has an aperture of 24 millimeters with a native focal length of 100 millimeters, but when you pair that with the camera sensor inside, the Sony IMX415 Starvis camera sensor, the equivalent focal length for the telephoto lens ends up being 675 millimeters with a 3-degree field of view and an 8 megapixel digital resolution. The wide angle has a focal length of 48 millimeters with a 50-degree field of view and a 4 megapixel digital resolution. Just a note on the 675 millimeter focal length of the telephoto lens. This is going to be really great for framing up deep space objects like the Andromeda Galaxy or the Great Orion Nebula. It's not going to be ideal for imaging or viewing the planets. There just isn't enough focal length here. You would need a telescope with I mean, at least 1,000 millimeters. And so that is an area where I think the Dwarf II could expand on functionality for the Dwarf II, whether that's with the use of a Barlow lens, or maybe in the Dwarf III, there's an option for, having a longer focal length. As far as how fast the lenses collect light, the telephoto lens has an f ratio of 4.2, and the wide angle lens has an f ratio of 2.4. I do want to talk a little bit more about the camera sensor inside. Again, it's the Sony IMX415 Starvis camera sensor. This camera sensor is popularly used in devices for security systems in situations where you need to be able to see in low light conditions. From the research I've done on the Starvis 415 camera sensor, it seems to work really well in those applications. And then just from my own direct experience with using the Dwarf II and the Sony IMX415 Starvis camera sensor, it does work really well. As far as achieving autofocus, you can achieve autofocus. That's because there's a step motor inside that achieves autofocus for the lenses. You can see that here, and you can achieve autofocus during the day and at night now. The Astro autofocusing feature that they just released in the latest firmware upgrade in late February of 2023 is fantastic. I just gotta mention that and give kudos to the Dwarf Lab team for being very responsive to the community and our needs, but also for just making it excellent. I had an opportunity to test it out and was very impressed. As far as manually focusing, you can do that as well inside the app, which I will show you how to do that. As far as filters, the telephoto lens does have an IR cut pass filter built in that you can turn on and off. And as I mentioned before, you can use the Dwarf II for solar imaging. You just need to use those two neutral density filters to protect the Dwarf II. And if you are in a lot of light pollution, you can use a light pollution filter like the UHC light pollution filter that I showed you. You could probably also use other 1 1/4 inch threaded filters as well. I have not tested that though. So on the back of the Dwarf II's optical train, there's this metal plate here. I don't know if you guys can see it. There is kind of a glare with the light, it looks like. But this is for the heat conduction module inside of the Dwarf II. This helps the internal structure here to not fog up when you are imaging at night, which I think is an excellent feature, especially if you live in an area with a lot of humidity. The Dwarf II also has a built-in pan tilt design with 2 rotatable axes that you can move manually and through the app. So one axis can move up and down, and one moves left and right. And so the Dwarf II has what's called an alt-azimuth telescope mount design, which is where the altitude axis here moves up and down, and it has the ability to move up to 240 degrees, which is also referred to as its pitch. The azimuth axis here moves left and right and can rotate up to 340 degrees. But traditionally, when you're taking long exposures of deep sky or deep space targets, your telescope would be controlled and supported by what's called an equatorial mount, or an EQ mount for short, which is just another type of telescope mount. And they're basically alt-azimuth mounts because they do have an altitude axis and azimuth axis, but they're tilted at an angle, which also corresponds to the altitude at which Polaris, if you're in the northern hemisphere, or Sigma Octantis, if you're in the southern hemisphere, sits in the sky. So in order to track a celestial body throughout a night of imaging, the EQ mount's polar axis would need to be aligned to the celestial pole of your hemisphere. So that's in part why the Dwarf II doesn't need to be polar aligned, just given the actual type of mount that it is. But the Dwarf II is able to track a target by using star tracking algorithms, which is pretty neat. An intelligent feature related to this is the Dwarf II's ability to recognize and track objects in motion during the day and at night, like birds, airplanes, athletes, the sun, by using several deep neural networks. So for us computer science nerds, here are a few of them. And so the networks are accelerated by the 2 TOPS NPU inside of the Dwarf II. And so all of this runs inside of the Dwarf II on its 4-core A7 1.5 gigahertz CPU. And so now let's touch on the prices. So currently there are 2 editions available, the Classic Edition and the Deluxe Edition. The Classic Edition includes the Dwarf II, the tripod, the carrying bag, the rechargeable battery, and the 64 gigabyte SD card. And the current pre-sale price for the Classic Edition, at time of filming at least, is $395 US. For the Deluxe Edition, it does come with everything that the Classic Edition comes with, but it also includes an extra rechargeable battery, 1 UHC filter, 2 neutral density solar filters, and a filter adapter. And so at time of filming, the pre-order price for the Deluxe Edition is $485 US. I will have links below if you do want to check those out. Those prices do not include shipping. The shipping costs are calculated at time of checkout, but they do ship worldwide, and I believe they are shipping out soon if they haven't already. So now let's go over how to set up the Dwarf and how to use the app. Behold, the fully charged Dwarf II. So now let's go ahead and add the SD card into it. All right, we put the SD card in here. Next, let's mount the Dwarf II to the tripod here on the bottom of the base. Next, let's place the Dwarf II on a flat surface in an area where it will have an open view of the night sky, ideally free of visual obstructions like clouds, trees, and buildings in every direction if you can help it. Also, try your best to avoid lights from nearby homes or street lights. This is where I think it would be nice to have some sort of dew shield option for the Dwarf II. And now let's make sure that the Dwarf II is in its default position. So let's align the body and the base of the Dwarf II up with these two lines on the back. And now we shall wait for darkness. And darkness has arrived once more. Now let's turn the Dwarf II on manually with the switch button at the top here. You should see the battery level lights on the side turn on, and you should also see this green oscillating circle light turn on. This is the indicator light, and it will change according to different operating states that the Dwarf is in. This green oscillating one means that the Dwarf II is on and is ready to be paired with the mobile app, and so let's go and do that now. So the app that we will be using to control the Dwarf II wirelessly via Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connection is called Dwarf Lab, and it's available for both Android and iOS devices. 9 times out of 10, connecting to the Dwarf II takes less than 30 seconds, which is really nice. The Dwarf II does have a Wi-Fi range of around 10 meters or around 3 feet. This is also going to depend on environmental factors like walls, trees, and other obstacles that may affect the Wi-Fi strength. I'm here in the Google Play Store. I'm using a Google Pixel 6 phone for this, for anyone who's wondering, but I have also used the Dwarf Lab app on an iPhone 12 Pro, just as an aside. So once you are in your app store, go ahead and type in Dwarf Lab app in the search bar, and once found, click on the app and download it. Once the app is downloaded, open it up, and Dwarf Lab will take you through their service agreements and network configuration prompts. Be sure to have your VPN off if you have one, and enable location settings so that the Dwarf II knows its physical location, which is necessary if you're using the Dwarf II for astrophotography. And so once all that is good to go, you're going to land here on the Dwarf Lab app home screen. So the home screen is pretty straightforward and has 4 buttons, at least at time of filming it does. And on the top right-hand corner, there's a settings button. There's also a button to access your photo album, a button to access Dwarf II tutorials, and the connection button. At a quick glance, here's what's under the settings button currently: camera settings, BLE and Wi-Fi settings, language settings, and current version. You can go back to the home screen with this arrow button here. And next we have the photo album button. So at least at time of filming, Dwarf II does not download the images to your mobile device automatically. Instead, you can preview them here in the app, and if you want to export an image or a video to your mobile device, you're just going to switch to local and then select the images and videos you want to export. From there, you can view the images from your mobile device's photo app. All of the images and videos are stored on the micro SD card, so if you need the raw images, you can transfer them to your computer in 2 ways, either by taking the micro SD card out and putting it into your computer and transferring the files that way, or via USB-C cord. Also, the file storage formats for photos is either JPEG or in RAW formats for FITs and TIFFs, and the videos are stored as MP4s. So let's go back to the home screen. We have a button for tutorials. This will take you to the Dwarf II tutorials landing page, where you can find quick guides on how to set up the Dwarf II and how to troubleshoot it. Now let's return home again and make sure that the Dwarf II is still on. Coolio. Now let's click on the connection button to pair the Dwarf II to the app. Here's where you're going to be prompted to allow Dwarf Lab to find, connect to, and determine the relative position of nearby devices I'm going to allow it. Next, you should see this searching the camera prompt, and as long as your DWARF II device is turned on, you should see your device name appear here. I'm going to tap on the device and the connecting the camera prompt is going to appear, and it's going to begin to pair, and I'm going to connect to the device. Okay, so you should now see that the connection pairing was successful. You're also going to know it was paired because the orbiting green light on the indicator circle on the DWARF II is now solid green. And also, if a new firmware upgrade is available, the app should prompt you to download that. So once you've connected, you're going to be able to access the imaging modes. The default mode is called Photo, and that's the one you're going to land on first, but there are 7 modes total. All of the modes share some of the same basic functionality, but they also include their own unique features based on their purpose. The shared functionalities and features are the battery level icon here. If you're near an outlet, you can connect your DWARF II via USB-C and keep it charged while imaging, which is nice. Otherwise, the battery is going to last anywhere between 2 hours or so. This is going to also depend on the feature that's used though. Next to that, we have the memory card status, and then to the far left, we have an X. This is going to take you back to the home screen and exit out of the imaging modes. Under that, we have the wide field and telephoto views. I'll show you how this works in greater detail during the astro mode. Under that, we have the exposure settings, which I'm also going to go over in greater length later on. And then under that, we have the virtual joystick, which allows you to move the 2 axes of the DWARF II, so you can move it left and right or up and down. And then you can also control the speed of those movements with this button here. It slides up for faster movements and slides down for slower movements. Then over on the right, we have this star icon. This is going to be the feature button, and every imaging mode has it, but the features are going to be different based on the imaging mode's capabilities, just like I mentioned earlier. And so, for example, under the photo imaging mode, it's going to have the ability to track an object. Under that, we have the capture button, and under that, we have the focus button where you can autofocus and manually focus the DWARF II. And then under that, we have the album button where you can access and preview your photos and videos. Now let's go over the non-astro specific modes by their special features. So if we swipe all the way to the bottom of the modes, we have what's called burst. And burst is where you can take a burst of photos using the feature button here to set up the imaging plan. The second mode that we have is called time lapse, and this is where you can create time lapses by controlling the amount of intervals and the duration. Next, we have photo mode, which again is the default mode. This is where you can take photos as a normal camera with both the wide angle and telephoto cameras, and can also track an object in motion like a bird. The images are going to be stored as JPEGs. Up from that, there is the video mode, which is where you can take videos with the wide angle and telephoto views. And under video mode, DWARF II can also perform object recognition and track the objects as you can in the photo mode. To start the video, just press here. The videos are 4K at 30 frames per second and stored as MP4s. I did take a daytime video of the sun, and the DWARF II was able to track it, as you can see here, which I think is pretty nice. After that, we have what's called pano mode, where you can take panoramas. You can create a panorama image with up to 1 billion megapixels, and the app will stitch the images together for you automatically instead of having to do it manually. Next, we have astro mode, and here is where we're going to spend the majority of our time. But before we do that, let's go to the final mode, and this is called astro dark mode. So before we begin imaging deep space objects using the astro mode, we need to take images that are going to help improve the quality of the DSO images as they are being stacked together. So the images of the deep space objects we are taking are called light frames, and we use what are called calibration frames to correct and improve the light frames. There are a couple different types of calibration frames, and they all serve a purpose in improving the final stacked image, but one of the types of calibration frames that we're going to be taking here are called dark frames, and taking darks are going to improve the walking noise and other types of artifacts that occur in our light frames from long exposure astrophotography. DWARF II is then going to use these dark frames and apply them as it live stacks the light frames in the app during the imaging session. So just follow the instructions on the screen, and if you're already outside, which I recommend anyways, so that the ambient temperature of the dark frames are the same as the light frames from your DSO imaging session, just make sure that the lenses are tucked in and put a box over the Dwarf II and maybe a towel to ensure no light will get through. Then just follow the rest of the prompts on the screen, and this should only take about 10 minutes or so. And then the images are going to be stored on the micro SD card and will be used during the Astro Mode imaging session when you see the live stacking appear. And I'm not going to go into the rest of the intricacies of dark frames and other types of calibration frames just because that's like a whole other video, but at a minimum, I really highly recommend taking dark frames. All that is to say that. Okay, so with the Astro Darks taken, you can remove the box that you used to, keep the light out or whatever else you used. And now let's go back to Astro Mode. And again, all of the same shared functionality as the other imaging modes are included in Astro Mode, but under its feature button, you are able to calibrate your Dwarf II physically, select the target you want to view or image, and the Dwarf II will go to it and center on it and track it. Additionally, here's where you're going to be able to set up your imaging session. You can set up the amount of frames, you can determine the storage format and how to view them. You can also adjust the histogram of your image, but we will get into all of this a little bit later. So the first thing we're going to want to do after the Astro Darks are taken is we're going to want to focus the Dwarf II. So let's start off in wide angle view mode with the telephoto view in the small box here. Next, just adjust the Dwarf II's eyes up towards the sky and look for either a distant city light, if there are any, or a bright star, or the moon. You can move the axes of the Dwarf II manually or through the app with this virtual joystick here. Once you have everything framed up, I'm going to be switching to telephoto now. I'm going to be focusing on the moon as well as the star field behind it. I generally start with exposure settings of about a gain of 100 and 1 second exposures and adjust from there based on whatever it is I'm focusing on. Here also is where the switchable IR cut filter is for the telephoto lens, but for this I'm going to be letting the IR light pass through. Okay, now let's try it to autofocus, and it worked. You can see that the stars in the background are very sharp and the underexposed area of the moon is also well in focus. So if you do need to manually focus, you can use the two other buttons here, the plus and the minus. You can also just dial in the focus if you want to as well. I do think a bottom mask would be nice just for double checking the focus, even if the autofocus was successful. But it would also be especially helpful if you're manually focusing the Dwarf II. If you're not familiar with what a bottom mask is, it's a little device that goes on the outside of your camera lens or telescope that's going to help you focus accurately on an astronomical object. It looks like this, and I do believe there are folks on Etsy who sell some 3D printed bottom masks for the Dwarf II, which is really cool. All right, so with everything in focus, let's make sure that our Dwarf II is back in its start position, the default position. So we want to make sure that the base of the Dwarf II and the body are both aligned as indicated by these two lines on the back. And we are good to go there. Now we want to make sure that the Dwarf II's altitude axis, so the one that goes up and down, is at a pitch between 45 to 80 degrees to the sky, which it may already be from when we focused. Just make sure that the Dwarf II has a clear view of the sky in almost every direction. So with all that ready to go, now let's begin the automatic calibration step. Under the feature tab, we have the calibration button. This is where the Dwarf II is going to take 3 images of the sky, and based on those 3 images, the current altitude, tilt, and orientation of the Dwarf II can then be calculated. And then from there, we're going to be able to pick the target we want to image, and the Dwarf II will perform an auto go to and center on it and begin tracking it. So let's click on the calibration button, and here we go. So the Dwarf II moves to the left, takes a picture, plate solves it, goes to the center, repeats the process, and then moves to the right and repeats the process again. It's usually a very quick process, but if the calibration does fail, just try to move the altitude axis to a higher or lower area of the sky to avoid any possible obstructions. And then after a few times, you'll get the hang of this, but it is very easy and very successful most of the time. Okay, so calibration was successful, and we are ready to select our target. So Dwarf Lab has a list of targets that you can choose from in the list here. If the target you want to go to isn't in the list, you can always use a planetarium app like Stellarium or Sky Safari to get the RA and DEC coordinates of that target, and then you can just manually input them in this section here. I do think it would be nice if the Dwarf Lab app had a built-in planetarium app that showed what was currently visible to the user based on their location, so that's something that maybe Dwarf Lab can consider in the future. If the target you did choose isn't visible or below the horizon for your location, then the Dwarf Lab app is going to notify you of that, so then you can pick a new target. This is, again, where I think it would be helpful for there to be a planetarium view of the night sky in the app, because not everyone knows what targets are currently visible to them, especially a beginner. Okay, so for this session, we're going to be imaging M42, the Great Orion Nebula. It's a very bright emission nebula located in the Orion constellation and is visible in the northern hemisphere during the winter months. So here we go. So the Dwarf II is slewing to the target and is centering on it. It's a fairly quick process, which is really nice. Just also as a note, if the Dwarf II needs to recenter on the target, then just do the auto go to again and it should correct the issue, but this rarely happens, at least in my experience. Okay, so we are centered on the Orion Nebula. We are in focus. Now let's adjust the exposure settings. So typically you're going to want to start with 15 seconds as your exposure time as soon as the Dwarf II centers on your target, just to make sure that there isn't any star trailing appearing. So to do that, just come over here under the S and select 15 seconds and wait about 1 to 2 minutes. If there isn't any star trailing and if star tracking is stable, you can either stick with the 15 seconds as your exposure time for your imaging session, or you can go for a lower number. But for the dark frames that we took beforehand to be as effective as possible during the live stacking, you're going to need to match the exposure time to those which were taken at 15 seconds. It's not the end of the world if the exposure time doesn't exactly match the darks, but it does matter for more optimal results. So for the sake of this, I'm going to choose 15 seconds since I don't have any star trailing. Another note, 15 seconds is the maximum length of an exposure for the Dwarf II due to the sensor. So now I'm going to adjust the gain. If you're not familiar with what gain value is, it's basically the same thing as ISO on a DSLR or mirrorless camera. It just refers to how sensitive your sensor is to the light coming in. So the higher the gain level, the more sensitive it will be, and vice versa. If you're in a lot of light pollution like I am, I'm going to keep my gain level low, and if you want to put on the light pollution filter, now would be a good time to do that and adjust the settings from there. It may take a bit of time for the screen to update when you make an exposure adjustment, so just give it a couple of moments to catch up. And for the other settings, you're generally going to want to use AWB as your white balance or auto white balance for DSO photography. And for the switchable IR cut filter, just ensure for the Orion Nebula that pass is selected. You can keep everything else at its default. So under the Features button, we're going to press on the More tab, and under the More tab we have Format, Count, Binning, and Display. For file format, you can choose between 2 different raw file storage formats. Under Astro mode, it's either going to be TIFF or FITS files. Raw file storage formats like these are preferred when taking astrophotography images because more data is stored in each exposure, which means the data is going to be easier to work with when you're processing them. For this, I like to use FITS, which is what most astronomy data like this is stored as, but if you don't plan on taking the raw images off and processing them in some third-party app like PixInsight or Cirrel, then just use TIFFs, but either way, you would be fine. So for count, I'm going to do the max of 999, but as a note, the longer the imaging session, the more field rotation that's going to occur in your stacked image, which is due to the fact that the Dwarf II, again, is an alt-azimuth mount. You can crop these artifacts away, of course, but you can also align the Dwarf II's tripod to your hemisphere's celestial pole, and this will effectively make it into an equatorial mount instead, which is going to help with field rotation, but that is for another discussion. But anyways, let's move on to binning. The default is going to be 2x2, which is fine. If you're not familiar with what bin is or binning, it just refers to the process of combining nearby pixels into larger pixels, often in a square grid format. So where normally it would be a 1x1 bin, you can bin the pixels 2x2 or 4x4, so on and so forth, which is going to improve the signal to noise ratio in your images at the sacrifice of a lower resolution image. Next, we have the display settings, and so here's where you can choose between seeing a stacked image of all the sub-exposures you're taking, or you can just see a live view of a single exposure. So if you're doing electronically assisted astronomy, this is where you would want to pick that option. For this, I'm going to pick stacked, and so once the imaging session starts, we're just going to wait for 2 images to be taken, and then the stacked image should start to appear. And then the stacked image is going to have a linear auto stretch applied to it, so you can actually see what the image looks like. Otherwise, it would be dark, just given that the data is raw. Okay, so with everything dialed in, let's press the capture button here, and we are ready to go. So here at the top, we have the number of frames that have been taken so far in the imaging sequence, and then we also have the number of frames that have been stacked together. So here in the live stacked view, you can see how many images have been stacked together. I am going to stop the imaging sequence a little early, but here's the final image from this particular imaging session. So if we look back to when the imaging session first started versus when we ended it, you can see that the Orion Nebula has a lot more detail, there's less noise, and this is really the power of taking multiple exposures in long exposure astrophotography, stacking them together, calibrating out the noise to reveal the beautiful details of these very faint objects. Again, if you want to take the raw files off of the micro SD card and bring them into your computer to process them in a third-party stacking and processing application like Serial or Deep Sky Stacker or PixInsight, you can 100% do that. So now let's jump into what my takeaways are about the DWARF II and whether or not I think this might be for you. So all that being said, some of the areas where I think the DWARF II shines brightest is in its portable and versatile design. So if you're somebody who likes to go hiking or likes to go jet setting and likes to have a portable imaging setup that is both good for daytime and nighttime photography, then the DWARF II is going to be a worthy partner for you in that department. Also, the fact that it has such a compact design makes it really nice for tracking DSOs and animals in motion like birds. And some other features that I really like about the DWARF II is its computing capability and some of the software features, namely the AI object recognition and intelligent tracking feature, which is really nice if you do like to, do videography and photography of birds. But also more astro-related, if you're interested in doing daytime photography or videography of the sun, so solar photography, that way you can track the sun without having to use any of the astro mode features because you wouldn't be able to because there's only one star out, so you can't calibrate. Another feature that I like regarding the portability of the DWARF II is the fact that there is a rechargeable, or you can recharge the batteries and reuse the batteries. I think that was a well thought through design choice on the part of DWARF Lab, but I also do like the fact that you can charge the DWARF II while you're using it. Along the same lines is the dual camera system design. I really like it for being able to frame up shots with the wide angle lens and then be able to shoot with the telephoto lens. I do think that's something that really sets the DWARF II apart from other smart telescopes. Another feature, more hardware related, I think that the DWARF II should have some sort of Barlow lens or something that can increase the focal length of the DWARF II. I know that's natively never going to happen, but maybe in the next iteration of the DWARF series of smart telescopes, maybe that's something that could be considered, just because planetary astrophotography is something that a lot of people enjoy, and so at 675 millimeters of focal length, you're just not going to be able to really see any detail of the planets, but it is still going to be really nice for solar and lunar photography, which I definitely had a lot of fun doing. So more software related features that I enjoyed is the fact that the DWARF II is wirelessly controlled. I think being able to use your mobile device to control it is just really nice. It makes it user friendly. The only real gripe that I have is when I would use the virtual joystick, it just wouldn't work very well. But other than that, the DWARF Lab team has been very responsive to the community about software bugs and setting out patches, so that's been really nice. And I also really like the fact that you can autofocus both during the day and at night. That was an example of the DWARF Lab team being very responsive to the community and our needs and incorporating astrofocus or astro autofocus in one of the more recent firmware upgrades for the DWARF II. And then another feature I really like is the ability to be able to go to a target without having to polar align. Of course, you can polar align it if you really wanted to, but not having to do that is really nice. I would say that you should update the list of targets that are that you can go to or that are listed. And I also think that it would be nice to have some sort of like planetarium view similar to Stellarium or Sky Safari in the Dwarf Lab app, just so that people could see what's in the night sky. It helps them to learn more about what's going on in the night sky when using the Dwarf II, and it also just makes it easier to be able to determine what's visible for them rather than clicking on something and it not being visible, and also not having to input your coordinates on your own. Of course, there are going to be situations where you need to input the coordinates on your own because it might be like a a less common target that's not even in a planetarium map. I digress. I do also love the live stacking feature. I think he did a really good job with the calibration and the registration of the light frames. And really the only thing that I would kind of, say could improve is the fact that when you're using astrodarks in that live stacking, if you took light frames at a different exposure length than 15 seconds, then those astrodarks are not going to work the most optimally that it could. That's just kind of one thing to consider, but not everybody is going to be a pedant about that stuff. Overall, the only other thing I would change maybe is being able to save videos in .avi or .sur formats. So if you want to take videos of the sun or the moon and bring them into PIP or AutoStacker, that would be really nice. So after several months of testing the Dwarf II with both the iOS and Android app, here are my thoughts about it. So from a purely astrophotography / astronomy perspective, I do think the Dwarf II solves a lot of the barriers to entry that astrophotography newcomers experience. A lot of the ones that I experienced myself were just the overall cost of astro gear, as well as the configuration of that gear. And the complexity of polar alignment and using a system that may not have go-to functionality, so something like a more traditional star tracker, as well as setting up an imaging plan that can be challenging in its own right. And of course, last but not least, but just even processing the data itself, which is definitely a big hurdle, or feels like a big hurdle. However, by no means am I saying that the Dwarf II is a substitute for your more intermediate to advanced astro gear, nor am I saying that it's going to be a substitute for using a third-party image processing platform like Serial or PixInsight. But personally, I do just think that it helps to, ease the feelings of overwhelm when you're first starting out in this field. And frankly, not everybody wants to capture, professional grade astro data. Some people have different goals and their journeys are going to look different. Some folks just want to be able to set something up that's really easy to use whilst camping with friends and, be able to image the Andromeda Galaxy and be able to show those images on their phone. And, there are other folks out there who may have, aspirations for one day imaging targets with more detail and using more advanced imaging techniques and processing techniques, might just feel overwhelmed by all of the initial first steps, and the Dwarf II might just feel like a, better first step for them. And then, of course, there are probably people out there who don't really know exactly what it is they want to do in their astro journey, but they just have, a inkling to try it out and want to try their hand on it. So all that is to say that there are a lot of different journeys out there, and it looks different for everyone. Overall, I am very impressed with the Dwarf II. I think it's a great choice for beginner astrophotographers, but if you're somebody who already has a DSLR and a star tracker and you're not afraid to kind of go out there and learn about the night sky, then maybe just stick with those things. But if you don't have a DSLR and you don't have a tripod and all of that gear, I think the Dwarf II would be a worthy choice as well. If you made it to this point, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys found this product review helpful wherever it takes you in your astrophotography journey. And please consider giving this video a like if you did like it, and subscribing to my channel. And if you have any questions, leave them down below. And until the next video, I hope you all have clear skies. Thanks, guys.